Johnny Lippiett here again for instalment 4 of my exciting new foray into the world of internet education. And today's lesson is going to be on the blues and the blues scale. Now this is kind of home base for me because when I started playing music, I came about it from knowing one blues scale that I tried to put over everything. Right? Literally, I'm not joking, quite seriously. Long before I had any comprehension or understanding of harmony, I learned a blues scale and I learned to be able to play it in a fairly emotive way. And I would just insert that over any improvisational possibilities, which got me surprisingly far, actually. Reason being, when you put a bit of yourself into something and put some emotion, some feeling, it's incredible how people respond to that. And we know that technical proficiency on the saxophone is obviously of huge importance, right? We all want to be technically proficient and be able to get around the horn effortlessly. We look at people like Chris Potter, who are just absolute gods of the saxophone, and we can only dream of being 1/10 as technically proficient as they are. But that, without the emotion and the feeling that goes behind it, it's like Data off Star Trek, okay? And I always like the analogy when people are talking about technical things, and I'll give you, for instance, somebody might say, oh man, they were playing Cherokee and they were playing it at 385 beats a minute, and oh wow, yeah, it was all so fast and everything was amazing. Data could probably play Cherokee at 900 beats a minute, right? Data could play giant steps in all 12 keys at 1200 beats a minute. But so what? It's devoid of meaning and it's devoid of the passion that makes humanity special. And one of the things that I love about the blues is the feeling and the emotional content it has. Now let's just assume, like I have in the other videos, that you're perhaps at a slightly more advanced stage of improvising. You know your scales, you understand harmony, and it's assumed that you would know all 12 blues scales, okay? Now the blues scale is such a great scale to practice being emotional on, because if we played a scale just on its own, right, I'll play a C blues scale, tenor saxophone, so concert B flat. Now that in itself doesn't sound like much, does it? Dee da da do 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 do. But if we inject a bit of feeling into some of those notes and bend that blue note, the flat 5, now there I was just creeping up to the major third, which is quite a nice technique actually. When we play the blues scale, to sometimes play the major third as well as the minor third. So it would become... Can you hear? I'm just going up to that. Now, the blues scale totally comes from the vocal techniques of the singers. If you haven't checked out singing, it's really a wonderful place to start. I was very fortunate that from an early age I loved listening to blues music. When I was at high school, when I was about 15, I was utterly rubbish at anything academic, but I was the kid walking around in the playground listening to Howling Wolf and Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker, Elmore James, Lightning Hopkins, and having an understanding of how that felt, the feeling in the music, and largely the history of the African American is encapsulated in the blues music up to that point. And I've always contended that the blues is the root system of modern Western music, if you will. And we know if we don't keep the root system of something healthy, the plant will bear no fruit. Now the blues largely came about with the slaves coming to America, and a lot of the early slaves who wanted to find religion and have God in their lives, a lot of them couldn't read or write, so they would go to the church and there'd be a sermon and there'd be a preacher, a minister if you will, and he would read passages from the Bible, and the congregation would sing them back, call and response, right? Antiphony. And you might hear something where the pastor or the minister would sing a pattern and a line that might have a musical sound similar to I went up to the mountain, and you would hear the congregation sing back da dee da 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 da. And there's some wonderful early field recordings from the Lomax brothers that document this really, really well, and it's worth checking them out. These people were called circuit riders, which is where the song CC Rider comes from, and they would travel around preaching the gospel. But a lot of people couldn't read. The only way they would learn was to sing back what they were hearing. And there was so much inflection of emotion and feeling within that. That's really where the blues scales came from. A lot of people think the blues came from the whorehouses and all that crazy stuff, right? But the blues just comes straight out of the church. We know that's true, right? The feeling and the emotion and the passion behind it. So when we're practicing our blues scales, I always like to think it's nice to try and inject some feeling into there, because without any feeling, it means nothing, right? So take a lick like, I'll play it firstly with no feeling at all, okay? Bit blah, right? But then it takes on life. It comes to life and it becomes animated. And it's always great practice to sing what we can play. Okay, I was always a believer that if we can sing it, we can play it on the horn. So if we play okay, that wasn't the best example, bit out of my range. Let's try another scale. Let's take a G blues scale. Okay, great place to start, I think, for my money. And again, there's no wrong or right, because you might hate this stuff. It's what's right for you, isn't it? But for me, Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin. You just can't go wrong with those two. They transcended all the boundaries of the labelling of music, and they could just make anything sound so bluesy and so soulful. And as we know, they were just consummate artists of the highest caliber. So really worth checking out Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin, and worth checking out some of the early blues music, because all the great players that we love come out of the blues, whether you like it or not. John Coltrane, straight out the blues. Sonny Rollins, out of the blues. Coleman Hawkins, Dexter Gordon, Lester Young, they all come from the blues. Charlie Parker was nothing but a blues player. Okay, he managed to make it sound pretty unique and original in a very, very modern, innovative way, but he was just a blues player. So trying to get that blues feeling into our playing, I really think helps to connect with the listener, because endless playing with no emotion tends to leave the listener feeling dry. But if we can invoke some kind of emotional feeling, especially with those flat fives, they're the real great notes to start practicing on. Now again there I'm using the flat 3 and the major 3, which I think is a nice thing to do. And that little trill I did there, you probably know that, the Cannibal Lick they call that. Tons of stuff on the internet about that. which is just using the side trill. I'm just going ba da 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 da. But that's a nice little trill to have, and it's good to practice it in different keys. So if you took that down a semitone, so I love the blues. I'm a sucker for this stuff. And some of my favourite players are people like Stanley Turrentine, Gene Ammons. They would just be drenched in that blues feeling. Somebody like Gene Ammons especially, and Gene Ammons, I'm sure you all know who he is anyway, but if not, he's well worth checking out because he had one of the greatest sounds, one of the largest, fullest sounds. I heard Sonny Rollins saying once that he would play in a club in Chicago and his sound could blow you across the lake. It was that big, it was huge, such a big sound. And the other thing with Gene Ammons, which is really worth remembering, is he was one of the first second generation musicians, right? His dad, Albert Ammons, was one of the first boogie-woogie piano players. So Gene Ammons came up immersed in that culture already. Now we know that unfortunately he had somewhat of a tragic life, and they say that he spent a third of his life in hospital, a third of his life in prison, and the other third in the recording studio. So we know he paid a price for some of that, and he had a problem like a lot of them did with substance abuse, but that was part of the time, and they played incredibly well, were masters in spite of that, not because of that. We've got to remember it was a cultural time of great difficulty in America then. But people like Gene Ammons, Stanley Turrentine's another one. There's just so many great blues players. Earl Bostick's really worth checking out as well. Coming back to the thing about technique, holy smokes, you know, you're going to knock your socks off with that stuff. Dewey Redman, drenched in the blues, nothing but a blues player. Ornette Coleman, blues player. We forget that a lot of the free players who people like, who I love, and you probably love too, Pharoah Sanders, Archie Shepp, Albert Ayler, all coming out of the blues, right? The blues really is where it's at, and I think a lot of people tend to avoid it for the feeling that it has a cliche, passe, oh, I don't want to play the blues, oh, who wants to listen to that? Well, I'll tell you who wants to listen to that. People. The audience, right? Because when you're playing a blues and that blues is popping, people are coming off the walls. There's no disputing it. Whether that's your aesthetic or not, I don't know. That's entirely up to you to decide that, and there's no right or wrong when it comes to what you like to listen to. But I know for me, listening to somebody play with that very, very bluesy, soulful approach to the saxophone is deeply inspiring. Yusef Lateef, there's someone for you, right? You want to learn about the blues, and there's a really good book, you should have it in your library if you haven't got it, Yusef Lateef's Guide to Playing Autophysio-Psychic Music. Sounds a bit of a mouthful, right? But Yusef Lateef didn't like the word jazz. He felt it labelled the music and it had negative connotations and overtones, so he always preferred calling his music autophysio-psychic, which basically means music that just comes from the soul. And in it he talks a lot about the importance of the blues if we're serious about being jazz players and playing in the history of what's gone before us. And he had a wonderful discography of selected recordings to check out, and some of them are pretty obscure, and the beauty now of the internet is you can get everything as a download, and some of this stuff, it'll really blow you away, you know. If you haven't really checked out much early blues music, you really should, because you'll hear just how much it has affected what we're listening to nowadays. The music coming out of Chicago around the time, Chess Records, so many of these players with blues players, Lou Donaldson, Jackie McLean. I mean, the list is endless. I'm probably missing a million names here. I'm just saying names that jump into mind that have been an influence for me. And even the modern players now are drenched in that. Take someone like Joshua Redman, Chris Potter, Seamus Blake, Chris Cheek. They all have that bluesy thing in their playing. Now, they might not choose to play that way all the time, but it's there. I remember Brecker was another one. When he played those blues licks, man, you could really hear the history of the music coming out from the end of his horn. So what can I say more about the blues scale? There's 12 of them, right? We know that, don't we? Okay, I think I muddled one up in there, but that's okay. It's always the way, isn't it? The teacher shows the student. And guess you're wrong. Which one did I muddle up? The F. Okay, so another thing that's good to practice is to practice playing an idea and taking it round the horn. So if I took an idea like a... Say to yourself, right, can I take that up a minor third? Up a minor third again. Now that's a nice lick because that's just the diminished scale. We forget the first 4 notes of a blues scale are in a diminished scale, right? If you saw my last video I made yesterday where we were talking about diminished scales, you'll see that in the diminished scale is the first 4 notes of a blues scale moving up in minor thirds, but we could try it moving up in major thirds. It's quite a nice one to practice too, right? Or you might, I mean, there's any number of licks and patterns, but the thing is to try working them round the horn. So on and so forth. And just getting used to that idea of hearing those sounds and being able to play them. Now we know when it comes to the application of this stuff, we are able to play a blues scale over a 2-5-1 progression, okay? We've got a choice of doing that, haven't we? If we took a 2-5-1 in C, which we know is a... We could outline that harmony like a... But we could just as easily go... Which is putting the blues sound. Now, as improvisers, we want to try and get a mix of the two, don't we? And that's, I think, where the beauty of variety lies. Learning these scales, learning how the sound of them works, and being able to put the emotive expression into those, and exploring the intervals with it. Obviously, we hear somebody playing a blues scale and they're just going... I don't know, that wouldn't do it for me, right? But if we hear them going... So what I did there was the first chorus was kind of outlining the changes and playing harmony. The second chorus was just the blues scale, but keeping time with it. So that's a really good thing to practice, trying to practice a 12-bar blues and just playing a blues scale, but keeping time with the form. So hopefully that's been of some use somewhere to somebody, maybe not, who knows. I don't know where any of this stuff will end up, but if it helps one person on their journey with saxophoning, then it's been a success. As I say, I'm just a humble student myself. The further we wade out into the ocean of music, the deeper it gets. There's no wrong or right. There's just what's right for you. Everyone has a completely different aesthetic. Everyone will tell you a different thing based on their life story, their history, their education, what they listen to, what they like to listen to, where they've been, where they want to go. No right, no wrong. But it's Johnny Lippiett here, signing out. And this was my little introductory session on the blues scale. Thanks, guys. Sayonara. See you tomorrow. Bye.